Thank you. So I'm back for culture, eating strategy, and compliance. We're almost at tea time. So, so I wanted to. I think in a way it's interesting. Just listening to Frank, there's a lot of trust required in that system. Whatever the technology is, there's still an element of trust. So regulators are also going to be in a position, I think, of having to determine to a greater extent perhaps than they might want to be whether or not an organization is trustworthy. And ethical business regulation. So the book that Professor Hodges and I wrote is called Ethical Business Practice and Regulation. And the essence of the ethical business regulation part of it is this idea that if you can either proactively, hopefully, depending on whether you have a one-to-one relationship with a regulator or in some other fashion, if you're in a situation where a regulator has hundreds of thousands of organizations that it's regulating, to create a more trusting relationship by the business, and the impetus should be on the business, by the way, to produce evidence of its ongoing commitment to being ethical, to doing the right thing. And the regulator, and Maria actually said this, that a regulator recognizing and encouraging that commitment. We're not saying that an organization has to be perfect before the regulator should give it more of the benefit of the doubt than it would give an organization that was really not trying to do anything. There's no such thing as perfection. And by definition almost, this would arise when something may have gone wrong, despite your best efforts to prevent it from going wrong. And that will happen no matter what you do. So, and I think it's important that regulators also understand that, and I'm sure they largely do. But the reason that we got into this was that Professor Hodges' previous book to this, and he's written many in a lot of different areas, dispute resolution, etc. His previous book was called Law and Corporate Behavior, and it was this 800-page yellow and black tome that he said would be really good to keep the door open or to throw at somebody if they were lunging at you or something, but it was just so long that nobody would read it outside of the academic world. So we tried, but it spends 800 pages, amongst other things, demolishing the idea that deterrence is an effective way of changing future behavior for a variety of reasons, and that the kind of state that we would have to live in for that to be the case would be such a police state that we wouldn't really want that. So, and my practical experience as a lawyer in companies and working in ethics and compliance is that too much of an emphasis on compliance is A, ineffective often, and B, counterproductive. Ineffective because trying to get people to understand overcomplicated policies, and certainly lawyers are definitely responsible, mea culpa, although I always wrote short, simple, easy to understand policies naturally. Not me. But the problem is that the sort of compliance profession, certainly in the area that I was most familiar with, seemed to be hell-bent on writing things that nobody could understand or put into practice. And whereas if you work on, I'm not saying, by the way, in any way, shape, or form that compliance isn't important, but for me, compliance is an outcome of a strong ethical culture and is balanced with the kinds of processes and procedures, et cetera, that you would need to have that would come under the sort of heading of compliance. But if you focus only on compliance, I think you can inadvertently end up with the other kind of behavior. And I think part of it also is, it's something that we struggled with in the legal department, is before you even walk in the door, or if somebody doesn't know you, they think, oh, lawyers, I hate them. It's really soul-destroying. You start out from this really negative base, and you've got to convince somebody that A, you're human, despite being a lawyer, and B, that you're actually trying to help them. But if you my experience then was when I was working more from the point of view of values and ethics and integrity, they kind of got that immediately, and it was like we were in a partnership to make sure that things went the right way. So I think it's a question of finding a balance, and as you'll see, that's part of what we're trying to do. So largely from my practical experience, based on Chris's research and more scholarly approach, we came up with what the other side of the coin is, which is ethical business practice. Now, many companies have done things like this without calling it that, or they have parts of it, or some portion of it. But just trying to think of what the elements are, and I haven't put them all in here, not because I'm trying to sell books, but because we only have a certain amount of time. But it's really about a commitment to having a holistic approach to your culture. And if you remember that 7 levels model I put up there, that's kind of the idea of holistic. You've got to really be paying attention to all these different areas of your business in order to create a successful business. And it needs to be based on what I would call true core values. Just out of curiosity, how many of your businesses have enunciated values? In other words, specific values that the company has told their employees, these are our values. Are there, how many? Quite a few. Were any of those values arrived at based on some form of consultation with the employees at some point in the life of the company? If they were, can you raise your hand? Yeah, far fewer, but many, so that's good. One of the things that you tend to see is that at some point or other, and I'm not talking about small organizations which started out as strong organizations with a founder who created principles and those principles have endured over the years. That's a slightly different situation. But where, if you sit in the boardroom and think, oh, respect, that's a good value, let's have that one. Integrity, that's a good one. And in fact, when I looked at the values of a bunch of large companies when I was working on this, you've got certain values that everybody has. So in a way, they're meaningless. Particularly meaningless if they were just derived by that kind of process of, I like this value, I like that value. Because the values should be really an aspirational description of who you want to be, who you are, what is meaningful. Values that you really need in order to accomplish your mission. And the only way to know that, in my opinion, is to really do something where you're talking to all of your stakeholders, not just your employees, but certainly all your employees, which is why I use that Barrett values approach that I showed you before. But there are other ways of doing it. So you need those true core values that are guiding people's decisions, because you can't be everywhere. Makes it easier to decide, should I do this or should I not do this? And in companies that are truly values-driven, you actually hear those conversations. Is this in accordance with our value of X, for example? Or that's not in accordance with our values. And then I think the other thing that's really important as a foundational approach is the belief that ethics is everyone's responsibility. Now, this may go against compliance thinking, but if you have a large central compliance department, the tendency for everyone else in the business to say, well, it's their responsibility. I don't have to worry about it. It's their responsibility. When Siemens had so many problems all those years ago, first of all, they tried to say they had a compliance department, which they didn't, and then they put 678 people in it. Yeah, so it's like from one extreme to the other. But I think the point is that you really need to get everyone in the organization involved in this in some form or another. The form that I chose many years ago was to create this idea of ethics ambassadors, which are people throughout the organization, different roles, different levels in the organization, who spend a little bit of their time helping, for example, if you have a code of ethics, or if you want to talk about your values, just getting information out, having conversations, and generally being kind of ambassadors for the idea of doing the right thing. You also need to have this learning culture that we talked about earlier, a just culture, where you don't punish people if things go wrong because of the system, because of a variety of things that happen, because that's how you set things up. And you need to have fairness, and you need to learn from mistakes. People need to be accountable, but actually, paradoxically, they'll be more accountable or feel more accountable in this kind of a culture. And then, as I said, this sort of compliance balance with ethics and integrity is important, not too much in one way or the other. So if you're going to create a different sort of relationship with your regulator, you need to be able to bring evidence of that. There are, this is an area where, in my opinion, I like to use something like the instrument I showed you, because you can see how the values are flowing through over time in an organization and being lived. There are other ways of doing it, and people are coming up with all sorts of things all the time. But I think the important thing is, it's important to look at your culture and be able to explain your culture, not say, well, this would be the ideal, this is the culture we should have, and we do or we don't have it. So we created two different frameworks. The first one is this, what I would call is culture and leadership, because really at the bottom of this, it's all about the leaders. Leaders doing what they say, not saying one thing and doing another, which is the quickest way to undermine your, you're going to create cynicism, and that is often the case. And then you also have to make sure that you have your systems and processes aligned with your values, your purpose, and doing the right thing for your culture. So that means particularly your remuneration structures. One of the things I think that is really the problem in financial services is such a high level of variable bonus creates conflict of interest. And also just the gap between the highest paid and the average pay creates a sense of a feeling of unfairness. There are a lot of things like that. But you need to have your performance management, if you have performance management, really take into consideration how did somebody accomplish what they accomplished, not just what did they accomplish. You can sell, you can meet your target, but for example, if you did it by promoting an a medicine for an indication it's not licensed for, the company could lose its license to operate, so that wouldn't be the right thing. So you really, and what we say holistic, meaning look at all the different areas of your business and ask yourself, are these aligned with our values and our purpose, and could they be unintentionally creating incentives to do the wrong thing? And I think targets are something that you really have to think about carefully. Because the other problem that we have, I think, with compliance in general and all specific compliance is this tick the box thing. You can tick every box and still people are doing the wrong thing. And so I think it's really important to figure out how to make sure this is a living thing and not just tick, 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 tick. That is just not the way it's done. So, I recognize that this next thing is very general, and it's not specifically about food safety, but I think, my point here for people in this area is you still have the same kinds of compliance things, but you do them slightly differently. You do them with more consultation, you make them more, you make sort of signing up to them, and I mean signing up not in a specific way, but people really understanding why I need to do this. You spend more time doing that. You spend a lot more time in the front end of getting people to understand what it is that they need to do and sort of socializing these things rather than launch it without any kind of consultation, discussion, etc., and then expect it to work. I run into this all the time. People saying, well, yeah, we want to do a consultation about our values. Can we do it in 2 weeks? And we've got 50,000 employees. No. Or we want to write a values-based ethics policy, but we don't really have any values. So can we just put some values into the ethics policy? No. You can, but it's a waste of my time and yours. And so I think there's always this huge rush to do things and a failure to recognize that the time you spend developing something is really time well spent. For example, in Borealis back in 2003 or 4, I was asked, could I rewrite the ethics policy? I just joined as the general counsel. And I said, well, I could, but if I did that, it would share the fate of anything else that comes out of the legal department, which is it would go into somebody's waste paper basket. So why don't I spend some time, get a little team up, and we'll do some talking to people. What are they concerned about? What are the issues they run up against? What do they want it to look like? Do they want it to be A4, A5? You think this is trivial, but Dan Ariely has also it talks about the IKEA effect. If you so much as attach a leg onto a table from a flat pack from IKEA, you think that table is more valuable than if you don't, if it comes fully assembled. Don't know why that is. Their research shows that. So if I've had some even small input into this thing that comes out and looks like an ethics policy at the end of the day, I have more ownership of it. So it's this thing of talking to people about what you're going to be asking them to follow later. Risk assessments, I don't need to tell you about the importance of those here in this audience. And obviously things need to be understandable to the people who are going to have to follow them. I think where we tend to fall down is that we expect that online training is going to be enough, that we don't need to have person-to-person, face-to-face training. My experience is if you really want people to own something, not only is it better that they have some face-to-face training, but if they could have that training from a peer, it's even better. So that's why I like the concept of ethics ambassadors. And here again, I had a huge battle with subsequent clients that I helped create ethics ambassadors because the lawyers and the compliance people kept telling me, well, they're not lawyers or compliance people. How are they going to explain our anti-corruption policy or our gifts and entertainment policy? And I'm like thinking, so these people, they're running these huge, complicated plants, and you don't think they can explain an anti-corruption policy if you write it to simply enough? Come on. And in fact, generally speaking, they can do a better job, in my opinion, because they'll explain it in words that people can understand. And then I think senior managers never understand that you have to over-communicate. Values, for example, have to become part of the daily discussion. What is the right thing to do as a question? Is this the right thing to do? An environment where people can challenge each other really has to become part of the woodwork. So I'm sure that all of the things that I'm telling you, you know already. So I'm going to leave a bit of time for questions. I just would like to say one other thing, and that is that this is not, actually two other things, sorry. This is not just a problem of an individual organization. As I think somebody showed you some of the Edelman Trust Barometer information earlier and about competence and ethics and things like that, I noticed from a tweet. It's the industry. It's trust in an industry is important. So if you have bad actors and you see this, it might behoove you as an industry and your trade associations and things like this to speak up and make sure that people aren't lowering trust in the entire industry. And so that's why it's important from the sector. The other thing I think is that from a point of view of people in compliance and safety and these kinds of jobs, we are going to be increasingly replaced in a lot of what we do by automation. And I think that's a good thing because a lot of the repetitive things are not really that rewarding. But then the question is, what do you do? How do you add value as a professional in these areas? And I think the way that we are going to increasingly do that is by understanding human behavior and risk and being able to devise ways of making sure that we're making it easy for people to comply, that we're taking into consideration things like normalization of deviance, where doing the wrong thing consistently just becomes part of the fabric until eventually you blow up a space shuttle, for example, or something else. And I think we will become increasingly more organizational psychologists and people who really understand risk. And I think that's important. And then the other thing is, of course, about sustainability. All of these things are really important for internal sustainability of our organizations, but also for sustainability in general. So we can contribute to sustainability both internally of our organizations by helping our cultures to improve, but also therefore we'll be able, as organizations, to make a contribution to sustainability. So that's all I have to say. I'm hoping you will have some questions, because if not, it means that I've completely confused you, and or it's 3:30 in the afternoon and you'd rather have tea. I don't know which, but...
Well, thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause. So we are now going to open things up for questions. It can be, if any of our other speakers are still here, it can be questions or general comments about any other issue. But let's kick off and see if we have any questions. Oh, thank you. Specifically on the ethics issues that we've just been talking about. Yes, we'll have the microphone there. Anybody after that? I'll be keeping my beanie. Sir.
Your point you made about the trust in the industry is critical. Now, who's responsible for that trust? Because, for example, the banking industry in the United States, okay, the government hasn't done anything. I mean, nobody was found guilty or anything like that. And the industry, it's hard to self-regulate themselves in terms of integrity. So what is the solution? The same, like, for example, in Canada, people say Canada is not a corrupt country, according to all the standards. However, there are specific industry, there is lots of corruption. Like construction industry in Canada is very corrupt. So the trust in industry is so important. Who's responsible to regulate that?
So I think the answer to that in the past would have been that the regulators were responsible for that in the U.S. Department of Justice, the Security Exchange Commission. But I think that should be the last resort. I think the individual banks, corporations, et cetera, are responsible for their own behavior. And that within an industry, if behavior is not acceptable, then I do believe that industry associations should be taking on that question, and I think some of them are. I mean, certainly, it's in the financial services industry, which I'm beginning to know more than I would like to about. I think there's a newfound understanding that the banks themselves have to pay attention to their culture. Now, that comes from an interesting place, which is the Dutch central bank, about 5 or maybe even 10 years ago, realized that they had to, or decided that they had to supervise culture. And so they send organizational psychologists into all of the Dutch banks, and they sit in on their board meetings and they talk to their senior executives, but they only look at the senior level. And then they kind of present a mirror and they'll say things like, your chairman doesn't let anybody else talk, or there's no challenge in board meetings, or the senior executives seem to be afraid to say anything. Now, I am grateful to the Dutch Central Bank, and they've taken a very professional way of looking at this. But I think it's a transitional approach. First of all, it's not scalable. And secondly, in other industries, it wouldn't work. But I think the point is that that's a parent-child approach. We need an adult-adult approach. That means industries, industry associations, and individual companies have to say, enough of this, we are going to tackle our culture and do it.
It's because that way of just forcing someone in, like a kind of Ofsted inspector or something of a similar vein, you can't imagine that they're going to be very trusted. You can't imagine they're going to be welcomed with open arms.
Well, I think that because it's, in a way, I think they've got used to it.
Right.
And also, by the way, that approach has come in here. The Dutch Central Bank has worked with the Irish Central Bank. They've worked with the FCA here. They've worked in Singapore. So they're spreading, and they're talking to European bank regulators and supervisors. So that kind of approach is kind of filtering in. But I think it really isn't the ultimate approach. The ultimate approach is you've got to take responsibility. In fact, I spoke in Australia in May to a financial services conference, and I said, why are you sitting there waiting for a regulator to tell you that you need to be dealing with these cultural issues that you have? I mean, it is very parent-child.
And when you go into different industries, are there notable demographic differences in the reaction you get, either gender, age, or the type of business it is, where some are much more open to you and some are not? Yeah,
I think there are all kinds of factors that could cause that. There could be cultural issues in terms of whether organizations are private or public, so they're used to being open in terms. I think there are some demographic. People say all kinds of things about millennials. you know, I'm anything but a millennial, but when I hear a lot of what's being said about millennials today, it was said about my generation back in 1965 or 8 or something like that. So I think we exaggerate to a certain extent some of the views about, I think young people just often have different views of things, and as you progress through life, different things become important. But I think that the financial services industry does certainly suffer more from these things for a variety of reasons, often having to do with the fact that it's all about money and numbers. So the kind of person who's attracted to that industry, the way that industry has run, the amount of money in the industry, I think that makes a difference. But I think in manufacturing...
Do you think some of those startups in financial services are very, whether or not it's cynical or whether it's genuine, you know, are trying to differentiate themselves as a different type? You know, I don't know, whether it's the Starling Banks or the whatever it might be, that their message is very much we're not the kind of wanker bankers. Yeah. We're the nice guys.
Yeah. Actually, there are many of those institutions. Some of them even well-established larger institutions who genuinely believe that values are important. And you would think that they would then be more, you know, much less likely to have issues, and they are. But I think there are a lot of different kinds of startups in financial services. One of the big sorts of startups that you hear are fintech, around how do we detect issues, ethical issues. And one of the things that I know I've heard about that they're doing is, for example, they're looking at metadata. They're looking at who's communicating with whom behind the scenes. Well, for me, there's ethical issues involved in doing that. And I'm also concerned in financial services that it's just going to all be data, 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 when really this is about human beings and their behavior. Is there another question? Yeah.
Rob's got a question at the front. Anyone after that? And then, sorry, we'll take those two, and then I have another one.
Yeah.
Mustn't forget.
Am I going first, Rob, or are you?
Oh, Chris.
You go first. We've heard enough from him.
Obviously, when a company is engaged in a culture program, you talked about consultation with and involvement of the frontline workforce. How would an organisation do that who has a large percentage of their frontline made up with agency or zero-hour contracts or even part-time? In certain catering industry, you would have ladies who come into a school, cook food for the school for a couple of hours and then go home, maybe do a cleaning job in the afternoon. You know, buying into a company's culture there it's harder to sell, isn't it? How would you suggest you get over that?
So a couple of years ago, the Bays commissioned a pilot on ethical business practice that we did in Cornwall, where we worked with Cornwall Council and a part of Cornwall Council, the one that is a local authority, primary authority for food safety, and also we worked with a local food business. And they had seasonal workers, and so we used this Barrett Values Assessment on both the part of the council, because originally they said, well, let's look at the culture of this business, and then we can have the business talking to the regulator and providing evidence of their culture to the regulator. And I said, but wouldn't it also be really important for the regulator to know what their culture is like, and also to understand how do you talk about culture, because this sort of gives you a language to talk about culture. And much to my amazement and delight, Cornwall Council agreed. And we did this. And so you have to, first of all, answering the 3 questions, anybody can answer them. If they can't answer them on a computer, you can give them a piece of paper and it can be fed into the system. So that part isn't a problem. And then you just have to run as many workshops as is necessary in order to capture as many people as possible. It's never going to be all people. And obviously people who come in and cook and leave aren't going to have as much of a sense of the culture. But the culture is present in so many different ways that often I'm sure you've had this experience, you walk into some place and you already figure out this is a friendly place, or this is a cold place, or I'm treated this way or that way. So actually I think a lot of the ways that culture is communicated are pretty obvious. So that was a really interesting experience, and both the business and the council found it incredibly useful, not only for their relationship, but also for their own challenges that they were facing. So that was
great.
Yeah.
Rob.
Oh, Chris, your question was much better than mine. So, Ruth, I was just going to ask you to talk about, often the people that NSF interact with are the compliance professionals in an organisation. And obviously, the culture that you need to tackle is not not just the compliance aspects, it's the overall corporate culture that they're operating in. What advice would you give in terms of trying to influence a finance director or a CEO that they should go down this path?
Thank you I should have mentioned that earlier, actually, yeah. So the first thing, there are two important things. One of the reasons I like to use the concept of ethics ambassadors, and that's something that you can create from the compliance department, by the way. So it's almost like they then infiltrate the company because you have a chance to work. I mean, I generally do 3 days of sort of a 3-day conference when I'm helping to create a network of ethics ambassadors. And but it's not so much, a lot of it isn't teaching them, it's more inspiring them and getting them to talk and that sort of thing. So that's kind of bottom up. So you've then got this group of people who are talking about why this is important, etc. But then I think the most important thing, and I also think one of the most difficult things, is you've got to work across functions. So the first problem, in my experience, is the HR department. Okay.
Anyone in HR here?
I don't care. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to pick on them.
No, exactly. I won't. I'm not going to mince my words. No, the problem with the HR, it's not. Okay, HR thinks they own values. Rubbish. The senior leadership team owns values. The HR department should be an help, and they should think this is a wonderful idea. Frequently, however, they think if it's not invented here, they're not interested.
They're threatened.
Right, they're threatened. So the first thing I think one has to do is one has to start kind of slowly and find ways to say this is good for both of us. Because I'm sure often you find that the HR people, to their are frustrated too. They want to get a better sense of values and culture. They can't get the attention of the senior managers. So what I've seen is if you can form a coalition where the HR people can say, look, the legal and the compliance people think this is important too, then you can come together. Finance people are often the last people, and that's why you've got to use those kind of arguments that I showed earlier. This is better for profit. This is better for your underlying business performance. And more there's plenty of evidence of that. So what my advice is create a broad coalition and use whatever kind of evidence is most likely to sway the person that you're talking to at the time. So, but yeah, it's a challenge, definitely.
Any further questions for Ruth? I was going to ask one, which is less to do with what we've already been talking about, more to do with the news and coronavirus and the kind of, when an organisation finds itself in a crisis, as most are in the next few weeks and months, and what tips, cultural tips, there are for pulling that through. And also, the thing of doing the right thing. I mean, people in this room are responsible for food chains and so on, which is going to be absolutely vital in the next few weeks. And I know you're not going to tell them how to do their job, but any wider tips that you might have?
Definitely. So the first thing I would say is that if you think about it from your own personal experience, when you're traveling or whatever you're doing, when something goes wrong, it's not what makes you angry isn't the thing that went wrong. It's how the organization dealt with the thing that went wrong. So my advice is this is exactly the sort of time when people will remember, long after hopefully this crisis is past, how you behaved during the crisis. And I don't mean just your customers, but certainly that's important, but also your employees. So the first thing is that's your duty of care to your employees, and not just the ones that are on permanent contracts. Treat people the same no matter what their contract is. And I think that that will create goodwill that will last way beyond the crisis. But I think that this is the time to be doing whatever small things you can do that will make a difference to someone. And don't do it cynically because to get brownie points, but do it because it's intrinsic to who you are and what you can do. And I think that will make a huge difference afterwards in terms of how, reputation and all the
Well,
rest
I was
of it.
wondering whether this might be the moment for the banks to gain some of that reputational loss they've suffered in the last, they are, so many of them are now going to be to try and give people mortgage holidays or help them with loans and so. And I did wonder, could this be the moment that they turn the tide of being the most unpopular industry to actually being there at a time of need? It might be very interesting.
It could be. I mean, I think in Italy they're now all mortgages. But the other thing is,
so few people in Italy have mortgages.
Well, that's
it's
true,
quite easy to do.
But the other thing is, don't wait until the government tells you to do it. In other words, doing something because you've been forced to do it you're not going to get as much recognition for that. Think ahead. What do people need? What could I do? What little thing could I do that would make a difference? WebEx, for example, Cisco has sent out an email to everybody who ever had any kind of a free WebEx account and basically given them a free, full business type account for nothing right now. So, that is huge. Because we're all going to be doing everything through virtually. So I think that's, and then, the other thing I would say about this time is this is the time to innovate. How can I do things differently? And what can I learn out of doing those things differently that will help us later? Yeah. I think we, never waste a good crisis. And this is a really good crisis.